on? Are we ready? All right. Thank you all for your patience. We were having some technology issues, but it looks like we're up and running, so let's go ahead and start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right, and Commissioner Johnson has kindly offered to give a prayer or thoughts tonight, so we'll turn the time over to him.
Thank you, Commissioners. Good to be with you. I got a confession. I wore a hat last week because I had gotten a new haircut, and I just couldn't deal with it, and so I wore a hat last week. But the point I wanted to bring up was, with every decision, and when you foray into new territory or try new things, there's pros and cons. And that applies to our decisions in public policy recommendations and decisions as well. I've noticed that the time for me to get ready every day has gone down, and I can go out in the wind without worrying about my hair anymore. And with the cons, which was a little bit shocking, my kids were crying when I was buzzing it, there are also pros. And I think it's important as we make policy decisions that we understand with every decision, there are going to be pros and cons. There's no way to make everybody happy, sadly. And it's just important that we try to see both the pros and cons of every decision. And with that, I'll say a prayer. Our dear Father in heaven, we come before Thee in prayer at the beginning of this Planning Commission meeting. We're grateful that we can meet together. We're grateful for the society and the system that we have that allows this type of participation. We pray for Thy Spirit to be with us. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and start with the first item on our agenda this evening. This is, we're being asked to consider the proposed zoning map amendment for the property at approximately 640 West Porter Lane, from an agricultural low zone to a residential medium. So we'll turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Commission. This is the property at approximately 640 West Porter. So it is both this larger, longer property right here in the green, and then also this little box, which will need to be combined if and when it is rezoned. So just a little background, and this is mostly for Commissioner Hinsey, since you weren't here a few months ago. Everyone else should be familiar with this property by now. Back in mid-year of last year, it came before the Commission for a rezone for the same application from going to agricultural low to residential medium, passed through the Commission with a recommendation, and then was denied at the City Council. Since then, the City Council has changed the density for the residential medium from 8 units an acre with a conditional use permit to just simply 6 with no option for a conditional use permit. So this size property being just barely over 2 acres would cap at 12 units on site. So that would be the maximum amount of units they could allow on this property at 2 acres. So the same questions that we asked last time. Is it consistent with the general plan? As you can see, it's completely surrounded by residential medium and very high commercial zoning. And we think that residential medium is a good buffer in between commercial zoning in general. And so obviously, because it's sandwiched on both sides with a higher intensity zoning, it does make sense for this to go at a higher density than agricultural. This property is certainly being underutilized at this point for its size and its location. So that answers the question, is it harmonious with the overall character of the existing development in the vicinity? Yes. Residential medium across the street and on one side, commercial on the other. Is there any adverse effects to this rezone? I would say that the staff does not agree that there is, that it's just making better use of the size of land. And The only problem for the rezone at this time is that there is kind of a slope to the property, which makes it a little bit difficult to connect to surrounding utilities on the site. It's certainly possible. Obviously, every site surrounding it is connected to all existing utilities, but the slope on the property and the length of the property do make it a little bit economically difficult for the property owner to connect to these sites. But it is certainly possible with private easements and agreements with the surrounding neighbors, or if the property owner wanted to put adequate fill on the site. So certainly not impossible, just more difficult than in some other sites. So as was with our recommendation a few months ago, our staff recommendation is also to accept or approve the rezone from agricultural low to residential medium.
Thank you, Cassie. Any questions for staff? If the applicant is here, we'd invite them to step forward if you'd like to speak to this matter. If you'll just please state your name.
David Bell, I'm the owner of the property. Appreciate your service and appreciate your time. I was here a year ago. I thought this was a shoe-in because they gave it to my neighbor who was a developer that didn't spend 30 years working in this city on the frontage road in an auto shop and raising his family in the city and things like that. And I'm really, it's not your fault, but this body should know I'm like shocked that I was treated the way I was at city council. And they rewrote the law because they said that they didn't, well, you know why, but so here I am saying, can I develop my property? And I will do something nice on there, I promise you that. And this one issue with the drainage, Corey, did we not get that straightened out with our easements that we sent to you? I thought that it was clear that we had easement right there next to my property. And I've got topos on it. Go ahead.
Just looking to the chair for direction when they want staff to participate.
Go ahead and answer the
I'm
question.
sorry, maybe I was out of order. I didn't mean to.
No, that's all right. The applicant did submit, there's a private easement, I believe, on the Les Schwab property. There's a private drain line there. The question becomes, we don't know the full parameters of that easement, of that drain line, and from my understanding from the Development Review Committee, the line would likely have to be upgraded. And so the main issue is the drainage of the property, whether it can go to the retention pond that's part of the Home Depot site, whether all of it has to go to Porter Lane, which would require fill, or whether this line would be a sufficient size, or is the easement right sufficient to cover installing that. So it's answered in the sense that there's something present. It's not answered, is it adequate yet at this point?
And I'm sure that you can work with the applicant as they work through
it's
the
more
process.
of an engineering issue. The utilities are in the area. It's now becomes that cost-benefit ratio. Where's the best place to drain the water? And that is part of their private decision on whether they want to fill, whether the easement has the capacity. It's an engineering question at this point, usually typically associated at the time of development.
Okay. Right now, we're just looking at the rezone, so.
Yeah, they ran calcs on it. I was told by the engineer how much retention I needed, and we got no problem with, we're going to be able to do it, so.
Okay. We appreciate your comments.
Any questions?
Any questions for the applicant?
Yeah, one comment, Dave.
Sure.
I don't know if it was a year ago, a few years ago, there was a tenant that lived in the house, I think at the back of that. He came to a public meeting and just was unaware of what was happening, and I don't know if he's still there, but I just thought to give you a heads up, and maybe he would like to know information.
Yeah, he cost me 2 40-yard dumps.
Oh, yeah.
Really quite the character. I'm sure maybe you didn't get breath of that when he was here, but he thought, yeah, he's no longer there.
Okay, well, that's
Yeah,
that's all.
no, that was weird.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This matter has been scheduled for a public hearing. If anyone would, so we'll open the public hearing, and if anyone would like to speak to this matter, we'd invite you to come forward now. And seeing no one come forward, we'll close the public hearing. Any other questions for staff?
Yeah, I've got one question for staff, I guess, as I was looking over this again, and I think this is a similar question that I had the last time this thing came around, is there's this one little sliver of agricultural zone here left. What we're talking about here is 2 out of the 3 parcels. To leave the one as agricultural, but that one, it looks like it's only 0.21 acres.
The front left?
That front left, that southwest corner. By doing this, do we put that one parcel, I mean, we're tying their hands essentially, because they have no option to do anything other than, I mean, they're already small, right? You can't do a whole lot with that anyway, but now they really have no option. Because you can't, I don't know. I just feel like maybe we're tying future property owners' hands by doing this instead of looking at this at a more holistic level view.
That's certainly a matter to be debated, particularly in your general plan. When you look at your general plan and areas that have a future rezoning, you set those policies. The choice of Centerville's general plan policy is not to force rezone of agriculture. So when you look at all the language, agricultural is to remain in place until such time that owners request. And so that is a consequence of the policy of rezoning as owners come in. The city certainly could have chose back in 2003 when they reconsidered how the zoning districts were going to work, reconsider that policy. They didn't. Certainly we could reconsider that policy in the future. But the general policy of the city is to leave agriculture till it's requested to be rezoned. So you make a point, but.
So I guess that you kind of answer my next question then as well, and that was, so you're saying that we would have to amend the general plan in order to notice for rezone of that as well?
Not necessarily. The city has the ability and its legislative authority to zone property. And the city can initiate zoning changes at the discretion of the legislative body or the recommendation of the planning commission. The city can do that. The city's chosen not to do that. So in this case, you have a request of a larger piece of property you would like to rezone, and certainly you make that decision. You know, the further one is what's to happen with that smaller piece that's agricultural low. And you're right, in its configuration, its future ability to develop is going to be somewhat hampered by what is being rezoned and developed today. I'm not sure at this point the gain in advantage. If the city wanted to come back and initiate an application, we'd have to notify that property owner and go through that process to do that. From my perspective, I'm not sure what's gained out of it, in the sense if the owner wants to keep the property as, we rezone it, but it's still in a configuration that's not being coupled with another piece of property, so you're in the same position either way from my perspective.
Right. I think that, and you know, maybe this is probably a problem that came about decades ago or something, whenever this little 5th acre was carved out of a larger parcel maybe. But it really isn't a situation where you can't do anything with it by itself.
Well, isn't it even the size non-conforming?
Yeah, that's
Right.
part of what I
So
mean. Yeah.
It doesn't even meet that zone.
Right.
So, and I do think that the city has the authority, if they wanted to rezone that on their own, they could, but it's generally not our policy to proactively rezone.
The other thing I'm thinking too is, I mean, I don't feel like by granting this rezone, it's actually preventing that smaller parcel from doing anything, because that smaller parcel can do what it's doing right now, and then it can also be granted a rezone if they want. And the only thing, I don't feel like doing this would hamper that smaller parcel from being rezoned to anything else.
Well, it couldn't, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to rezone it to residential low, for example, because it's too small for even one unit at low. It'd be medium, and you could put one unit on it at medium, right? It's pretty much going to be medium, unless you could convince somebody to go high, which is unlikely.
So hypothetically, we don't rezone this one, which I feel like we should, but let's just say hypothetically we don't, and that person comes to us for a rezone, what would they rezone?
Yeah, they'd have to go medium really. That's the only thing that
Anyway,
makes any
so it
sense.
seems like it actually would just go with medium anyway. So for me, I feel like there's nothing about, I mean, that parcel is small enough and it's in the situation where it is that I don't feel like anything surrounding and a change in rezone, anything surrounding it would affect that parcel because it's just already the way it is.
Right, and I think that this is probably, like I said, a problem that came about a long time
Right.
ago that we're now faced with this one, in this case, so,
Right.
anyway, just a good discussion to have here, and, anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a good discussion because as you consider anything into the future, particularly city-initiated, keep in mind what might happen as you make that policy decision to set forth leaving things as is until the future. There may be a better advantage to look at it on a broader perspective as you decide areas and not cut a parcel out or create an opportunity that, for lack of better terms, wedges it into the situation you're talking about.
Which I agree with you, Corey, but I feel like I appreciate the policy because it errs on the side of property rights and it errs on the side of people choosing when they'd like to have their property rezoned. So to me, even though it does create some disharmony sometimes, I feel like it's better to maintain that ability of the property owner to do what they would prefer to do with it, even if it causes some problems that are, in my view, very minimal.
Thanks. Any further discussion? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
Chair, I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend approval of the zone map amendment for the land parcels 03-001-0178 and 03-001-0179 from agricultural low to residential medium, provided, however, the unproven division of the parcel shall be combined into a single parcel on the county's records prior to any approval of future developments. Oh yeah, I suggest also the reasons for that motion as found in staff report 1 through 5. Thank you, Lisa.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? Yeah, we'll take a roll call, starting with Commissioner Hensy.
I agree or I approve. Aye.
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 No,
Aye.
Thank you.
that's a no for some previous council, really. Thanks for throwing us under the bus.
All right, thank you very much. We'll move now to our second item on the agenda. We are being asked to consider the proposed zoning text amendment, CZC 12.42, regarding impervious surface requirements within the hillside overlay zone. And we'll turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the commission. Your applicants frequent here. It might be a frequent applicant flyer award, and see how many miles he can get out of his coming before you and discussing his project. Kind of stepping back, you're aware of his project is a agricultural low zone subdivision. You have 4 lots. Most of the lots center somewhere around the required minimum of a ½ acre. You do have a large lot at the end of their cul-de-sac development that's a little over 1 acre in size. And it's this acre in size issue that Mr. Hale's coming before you as we look at it. First, stepping back to just the ordinance itself. Staff, from our perspective, recognizes that the hillside overlay is somewhat outdated. We've run into this various issues with the hillside. It was created quite a long time ago. In 2003, when the city did a holistic zoning code change, the sensitive lands overlay chapter was reserved for future overlay to be developed and expanded. Until the meantime, they carried over the old hillside from that previous code into the new 2003 code. We've not used it frequently in the city. A lot of the hillside overlay in the south end has been developed. and there's not as significant amount to be developed in the south end of the city. On the northeast end of the city, east of Main Street, north of Parish, is where we have a significant area of hillside overlay in place, and on the most significant amount of property that is undeveloped. A lot of that is the Rigby Farm. You've seen Bruce Pitt develop his subdivision. The Smoot subdivision was within the hillside, but its subsequent phases, it was grandfathered, for lack of better terms, non-conforming. It's not really non-conforming, but it was kind of grandfathered, saying all of those phases of Smoot don't have to comply with the hillside necessarily. And so we've not used the hillside ordinance very frequently because most of it's been held up in land that owners have not wanted to develop. You've discovered as late a couple of pieces have come to you. Mr. Chad Morris came to you with a small piece. Mr. Hale's come to you with a fairly significant piece, and we're using that. What I perceive in the ordinance is that it was really built around the policy of our general plan. We're going to attrition most of the city from agriculture to residential low. So when you do read the ordinance, when you see the phrases agricultural low thrown into the hillside overlay, it's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. It's roughly quarter-acre zoning. Oh, by the way, if it's agricultural low, this is how you treat it. It was not a comprehensive ordinance in relation to other types of zones. And so we're finding ourselves where there's a shortcoming. So the example tonight's shortcoming is impervious versus pervious coverage area. This is how much of your lot can be covered with development and versus how much of your lot needs to be remain where water and storm drain can drain into the property. This is partly built around our impact fee for storm drain, how much we're charging every lot contributing to the storm drainage system in the city, and there's assumption. The standard assumption is a 60-40 split. 60 can be buildings, houses, gazebos, driveways, sidewalks, patios, whatever you choose to develop it. 40% would be the green area of landscaping. That's the typical ratio. In the hillside, it changes that ratio and reverses it and puts it at 40% can be covered with buildings and hard surfacing, and 60% is supposed to be open. Part of that design is you're on the hillside. You're going to increase some drainage events that are going to occur on that hillside, and we're trying to capture some of that through the infiltration into the ground as we plan our storm drain system. Well, if you look at the hillside overlay to Mr. Hale's lot, he has an acre, and the interesting part is it says there's a cap of 40% or 5,000 square feet of build area, whichever is less. And so this is really built around the concept that when we attrition single family, the quarter-acre lots, the 5,000 square feet of build pad is what you're setting aside for somebody to use for your home. We're trying to find the flatter areas, the more level places that don't create significant cuts and fills, and use that as your development area. Mr. Hale's lot is an acre in size, and so he has 1 acre, but according to the hillside, he can only use 5,000 square feet of that acre for his house and improvements. So you can see now where there may, from our perspective, there's a disparity, because if that lot were rezoned to a residential low and could get 4 out of it, the 40% would come out 4,300 square feet or something close to that, and not quite the 5,000. You'd still get the less, but there would still, so it's almost encouraging, hey, don't do agricultural lots, because if you come in with RL, you can cover more, you get more lots and you get more space to cover. And so we think there's that disparity. So we talked about it as a development review committee. We think the 40% is still an important factor. But what's this, with an acre lot, the 5,000 square feet feels really restrictive with an acre lot. How do we handle that? What we've come up with in talking with their engineer and our development review committee is that let's keep the 5,000 square feet. That's what it's The storm drainage impact fees, the expectation of water draining off the lot is all built around that 5,000 square feet. But if there's opportunity to go above that, and it seems sensible to do that, we could use the gap between the 5,000 and the 40, but this time you have to do your own on-site retaining. You have to do your own study for how much water would be generated onto your lot and how that excess drainage would be managed beyond the 5,000 square feet. And if you see the applicant's petition to you, is wildly foreign to me with all the calculations and engineering on a 25-year storm event. They agreed, the engineer, his engineer, our city engineer agreed we should use the 25-year storm event, not the 10-year. So it's going to be a more aggressive calculation than our standard 10-year calculation. And that upon approval of the city, if you want to go above the 5,000 and you have area to do it and you don't exceed 40% of your lot area, and you can achieve a retention that meets the specifications of retaining the water, not retaining, detaining it in a storm event and then releasing it after the storm event, that would be adequate to handle the drainage flow and exceed the 5,000. So hopefully that makes sense. So we had Lisa, the crafter of engineering calculations, simplify the language, and so we contain that in your staff report. It describes the expectation that your 5,000 square feet still don't exceed 40, but in that gap you'll do a 25-year event. But what's really important that I left out is we don't want somebody having a piece of property that is 90% cliff and using that in their 40% calculation. So we're saying, okay, development is, we categorize it to 10% to 20% to 30%. 30% is off limits, and we're saying when you hit 30%, it's off limits from your calculations also.
Great.
So that's what we're recommending, and we'll see if you agree.
I appreciate that explanation because it was a lot clearer the way that you just explained it than the way it was. I mean, reading through it with your explanation makes a lot more sense.
Yeah,
So,
I
thank you.
decided that the 10-page report wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
So I would do the explaining at the meeting.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Any questions for staff?
I have a question. So as you explained that the property owner, if they do exceed, they have to detain until after, do we have a lot of examples or a lot of experience with that right now?
Typically you have that in your commercial development, so an easy place to think where detention occurs. Marketplace Drive, Bank One, well, I call it Bank One, what is it?
It's Golden West now, Golden West Credit.
Yeah.
They're gonna be mad at me. It's in my burn, it's like Delta Center.
Right.
They're gonna be
Yes.
mad at me.
Bank One hasn't been a bank for like 10, 15 years or something.
Yeah, it's starting to date me.
Do we have it in residential areas?
Yes, what you have typically where it generally shows up is where the subdivisions have not been developed, but you have historic lots of the past. Yeah. And even in our Old Town area, you have a vacant lot, it's a downhill slope lot, or it's sloped perpendicular to the lot. They go through a process with the commission at this point. We might be talking about that, but with the commission to develop that lot, to get the infrastructure to it, to pay their fair share of impact fees. And often you will see the city engineer require in those cases some type of on-site detention. So
Yeah, and I think that's actually the direction that the standards are going, is that it's on-site detention for certain flow so that you can limit how much flow goes into our system. So basically you detain it and then at a certain calculation, you discharge it into the storm drain system.
Okay, so we have experience with that, and it's generally a positive experience.
Yes, I would say generally positive. I will give you the con side since we talked about pros and cons.
Sunburns.
Yeah, sunburns. It's not problematic, but what becomes complicated is getting the easement to make sure that the detention takes in place. That's a little extra step in engineering and easements and so forth to ensure that the detainage area perpetually stays that way. And then I think the longer version con to the issue is that down the road, as somebody starts dreaming up their backyard, you can see where in their dreams they start dreaming of patios and other things that are taking out of that capacity, and then they come into the city looking what to do, and we say, oops, we got to attenuate your dream here. You're disturbing the detention areas. That's probably a con that people don't think about down the road.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? Okay, we'll invite the applicant to step forward if you'd like to do so. State your name for us.
Fred Hale, I'm the owner of the property, and appreciate all the work that staff has done on this thing, and I think, you know, I was kind of surprised when I turned my house plan in to get a building permit, that Cassie called me and says, hey, you can't build this big of a house. And you know, I think Corey even mentioned to me in the process that, you know, you're limited. Do you remember that, Corey? I didn't know what he was talking about. I thought, oh man, I got 46,000 square feet of dirt. You know, let me.
How much limitation could there be?
Yeah. So anyway, here I am. The plan is in to get a permit. You know, since the staff meeting, then just listening tonight, and then kind of looking at that 46,000 square feet of dirt that I've got, you know, even at limiting it at 40% is kind of tying my hands a little bit. Not that I want to build a bigger home or that, but if I want to put and Corey just mentioned it, patios or a basketball court / pickleball court, you know, that I've been thinking about. You know, and then in the last staff meeting, we talked about the retaining on the property. If I can retain more and release it slower through these little what's the proper word on that? Orifice or something like that?
That's the proper word. The nickname is a snout.
Snout. Okay. You know, I would like to even exceed the 40%. And maybe even go to the 60% thing that the other zones have. So anyway, that I'd like to be able to do something with, you know, I just don't want to have 30,000 square feet or so of garden or grass, you know. So anyway, and I think Lisa would be upset at me for even trying to do that because she's gone through a lot of work to do it, but I'd like to throw that out to the commission and just see where that flies. So anyway, any questions? Does that make sense?
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, this matter has been scheduled for a public hearing, so we'll take this time to invite any member of the public to step forward and speak. And seeing no one step forward, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing. Any further discussion? Any further questions for staff?
Yeah, Corey, can you explain to me again, and perhaps you did this in your thing, and refresh me as I try to understand the applicant's request, where we got to the 40% versus 50 versus 41 versus 60?
I wish I could give you the history of the 40%. I can't. It comes from the ordinances of the past that I wasn't here. It's the gap is 60% on a flat and reduces it 20% down to the 40% in the hillside. The principle is that you're increasing the amount of flow on a slope. The ability for erosion and pressure of the aggregate of a flow increases the steeper the slope goes. And so you're trying to, on the hillside, you know, it's coupling a couple of things. First of all, how much flat area do we have to work with? We just don't want to go in and start cutting in fills. And then the area that we allow to develop, you're trying to keep development somewhat into that area because it's the slope areas that are undisturbed that can manage some of the flow, but you're still on the slope, and that's going to slough off, and you're hopefully recharging into the ground before it hits the next piece of property and the next piece of property. I mean, think of the floods of '83 the debris. I mean, that's what you're dealing with, but you're doing it on a lot-by-lot scale to it. So I don't know where the 40 was a magic number, you know, from the historic past. You know, could have it been 45%, you know, maybe. I think the percentage, if we were to rewrite this ordinance, and I think that's why staff is staying at the 40%, because there's some other things to be thinking about. You know, slope, Mr. Hale's property maxes at about 9.75%, but you can have build on slopes above 20%. So you can see that there's going to be a change in what the flow does at something above 20% versus something below 10%. But we are not prepared to go in and say, should we further categorize that at this point? We've not done an analysis and determination to say further categorization of it. We're just taking the ordinance at face value and say, how can we preserve the intent of the original language and still cover the issue of erosion control inside of that ordinance? If we came back, you know, we might adjust the magic number for less than 10% maybe is at 50%. I mean, and above 10% is, you know, 45, and above 20% is 40. I mean, that's a possibility. And I'm saying more than I should, that you probably want, but we're just not ready to say to do away with the magic number at this point until a further analysis and drainage is looked at.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I'm open to considering a different percentage if I were to understand the reasons behind the 40%. However, at this time, I would not feel confident as a body right now without that analysis and good old Kevin weighing in on it. Sorry, Kevin Campbell, the city engineer.
Oh, yeah, right.
You too, Kevin. Weighing in on it in order to make that determination. I am prepared, however, to pass this up, but I don't think I would feel confident changing that number without fully understanding the ramifications.
Yeah, and I think that the intent of the hillside is that there are challenges in building on the hillside. You have different kinds of soil, and the erosion issues, so it makes sense to have a lesser percentage of impervious surface because it's just going to be flowing downhill. So it makes sense, and I think as a group, the Development Review Committee didn't want to change that. With this amendment, I think it's important to note that we are going up from 5,000 square feet of impervious surface on a 46,000 square foot lot to over 18,000 feet of impervious surface. So we felt like this was a huge jump, or a significant jump that's legitimate for an acre lot, but to be conservative with that coverage and keeping the intent of the hillside ordinance.
So can I do some hypotheticals?
Mm-hmm.
So hypothetically, we were to rezone this to residential low, like Corey, you were saying. So then at that point, this amount, this total 1 acre lot would then be allowed how many?
Yeah, I forget the number that I ran. It wouldn't reach the 5,000 if you just had a 1/4 acre lot. It's somewhere just over 4,000. I think it's about.
But you're
40.
saying in RL, at the same size lot, it would be the same answer?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
The exact same
So it
amount?
would be 18.
Whether it's RL or AL?
Yes, excuse me.
Okay, that's what I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, if it was RL or AL and it's still an acre, it's,
Because 5, 10.
So it'd be 20, so it'd be a little bit more.
but if that acre lot was divided into the 1/4 acre lots, there would be a little bit more square footage than
Right.
the.
Yeah, this ordinance doesn't distinguish between what type of zone you're in.
Right, but I think
So-
the hypothetical, if I'm catching it right, is let's say that acre was divided into 4 lots.
Right.
Now,
Oh.
what would the coverage be?
That's the
okay.
question I
And
had.
it's about somewhere around 4,300.
Yeah, I thought you said
Per lot.
4,300, so.
I think it's the
4,300
same. If you
times
do the math,
4
it's the same.
Is 17,200, so it's actually a little less.
For,
Oh, wait, no,
40%.
because I
No,
did, the 18,000 was on 46, and there's only 40, oh no, 43.
Because you're about 10.8
43.
for a 1/4 acre lot.
Yeah, anyway, you get
lots of
17,000.
numbers going on right here. Can
No,
someone give
wouldn't
me?
it just be 20,000 because you'd have 5,000, assuming the 5,000 is the
Well,
less?
you wouldn't be able to hit the 40%, is what I'm trying to say.
So
You're going
at-
to drop below. It's going to be, because it's Yeah, it's 40% or whichever is less, and on a 10-8 lot, you can't get to 5,000 is what I'm saying. You can only get to
Okay.
about 43.
You can get to 43. So 43 times 4 is like,
So it's-
43,560 times 44% is 17,424.
okay,
So that's a pure 1
That's
acre,
just-
but I think what Corey's saying is it probably would limit it if you were dividing those lots up. Well, let's just do quarter acre, so
Yes.
43560 divided by 4. So you'd have a 10,890 square foot times 0.4. You'd have 4,356 times 4. Oh, shoot.
I'd have
You were
17
pretty
of
close,
4.
Corey.
17.4.
and so right now
17.4
we're
versus
giving.
17.2.
Okay, right, 17-ish. And right now, with the full acre just being itself, it's 18.
The particular lot, I think, has about 46,000 square feet, so slightly more than an acre, and they would get 18,200.
Okay,
Yeah, it's 1 point something.
okay. So that was my question, is I wanted to see if there was a significant difference between having it as this zone right now
Yeah, that makes
versus
sense.
having an RL in this hillside development.
So it's fair, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other further discussion? The chair will entertain a motion.
I got it. I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend to the City Council to approve the proposed hillside overlay amendment, CZC 12.42.040D, as outlined in red in the staff report with suggested reasons for action A through D.
Second.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate?
I think it's important that we talk about I like the reasons why that we talk about, which are suggested reasons, but also as a body to just reiterate that in the minutes. And so I think, given the fact that our city engineer and what do you call that?
The Development Review
Development
Committee.
Review Committee has met to look at this particular situation that obviously is different than what was originally in our ordinance, and trying to address the property owner's issue brought up by the property owner that could be an issue in other situations that also would be similar to those that were zoned differently while maintaining the spirit of the hillside overlay zone, and also allowing for material to be, adequately drained and things like that. I think this answers a lot of questions that we had, a lot of the concerns of the applicant brought up, and also allows us to sort of reach a good middle ground, and then we can discuss further if there needs to be some sort of tiered system. I know that we talked about that with, lot frontages in the overlay. Just recently, we have a tiered system that we were able to address after we've done some more research. I think that's a good direction to go, but at this point, like Logan said, I feel comfortable with just that flat determination without any further engineering.
Thanks. Let's go ahead and take a roll call, starting with Commissioner Johnson.
Aye.
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 Great.
Chair Hammond, may I
Yes,
engage Mr. Hale?
of course, go ahead.
We did double notice this, as we had talked about. We weren't sure the commission would go for it, but in a timely thing for the permit submittal, we double noticed it and would have to table it. So it's on the May
First.
1st
Next
meeting.
Tuesday.
The risk of the double notice is that they wanted to table it, so you lucked out tonight.
Chair, thank you. Chair, I wonder if it would be appropriate, just basically based on what we just said and what I realized was one of my goals as a commissioner to explain my reasons for why I'm voting a certain way. If it would be appropriate to go back to the previous agenda item and just allow me to explain my reasons for voting, because I know you asked for that and then I forgot to do it and then I remembered why I was voting a certain way. How does everyone feel about that?
I'm happy to allow you to state whatever you'd like on the record.
Just for the record, the reasons for voting were also because I appreciate that the City Council has gone through and looked at residential medium citywide, has updated design standards that create a better overall product. There was some issue with the previous residential medium that had that the residents were concerned about the width of the streets, and they addressed street width and they increased that. They also added, correct me if I'm wrong, sidewalk requirements for something?
The sidewalks were defined for both sides of the street
Both
unless
sides.
an alternative plan was approved by the city.
Right, so they increased the amount of sidewalks that allow it to be better accessible. And then obviously the density cap of the 6 units instead of just the CUP. So with those changes that were implemented from the City Council and some of the concerns that were brought about the last time the submittal was given, I think that also allows me to feel comfortable with granting that rezone. Thank you for indulging me.
Moving on to our third agenda item, we have staff and commission scheduled to discuss the administrative procedures, state requirements, and also discuss possible amendments to procedures on the city level. And I will turn this one over to Lisa.
Great, thank you. In response to the Planning Commission's request at your last meeting, we'd like to get more proactive on your goals. And so one thing that I offered was to help with the administrative decision process and see if there's anything we can simplify or change the ordinances so that some of these decisions might be made by staff. So in response to that, I prepared 3 different charts for you to look at the decisions that you make. And I divided those, I did legislative and then zoning administrative matters and then subdivision matters. Subdivision matters are still administrative, but the reason I did a separate chart for those is that they're in a different part of our code. So this was an easy way if you want to tackle one, or, you know, it just mentally it was helpful for me to just have subdivision ordinances. But then so I'll go through these charts, and I was telling Cassie and Corey I was thinking about 15 minutes, but it might be more like a 20-minute thing with your discussion, because I also have some suggestions. But before I get into the chart, well, I also handed out a chart on the kinds of decisions that you've been making. So in just looking at the charts, the matrix, the Planning Commission actually is involved in 5 different legislative decisions, 12 administrative decisions, and 4 subdivision decisions. So these are different types of applications, okay? 5 legislative, 12 administrative from the zoning code, and 4 subdivision. So you are involved in more than 20 different kinds of applications that come to you. And so on this chart about where you're spending time, I thought it would be helpful if you're trying to say, hey, we want to free up some time so that you can work on other things, but also understand where you're spending your time. So I went back to the packets for the last 3 years of Planning Commission meetings and just put a little mark on what kind of decision, what kind of applications were on the agenda. Now this, if you dealt with the South Main Street plan 5 different times, I put 5 different marks, because even though it's the same application, you are spending your time. So that's kind of represented in this chart. But and I don't know why in 2016 we were down. You know, you can see in 15 and 17 they seem to be comparable years. But essentially, in just looking at this chart, I thought it was really helpful because obviously you're spending a lot of time on zoning text amendments. But that's a legislative decision, and you don't have any choice in those matters coming to you. We do a lot of zoning map, so those, we don't really have any choice in the matter, but you do spend a lot of time on those. You spend a lot of time on conceptual and final site plans. I think that's the next most common application that you see. Other than those anomalies from 2016, I don't know why those were so low. And then conditional uses, you know, a medium amount of time. And then I was surprised, maybe because from staff's perspective, the subdivisions take up the most of, well, or maybe my time. Subdivisions take up the most of my time, but you really don't see that many subdivisions. So hopefully this chart will be helpful as you're looking to, you know, figure out where you spend your time. So then let's look at these, the matrices that I put on the packet. And the first one is the zoning, and I think you only asked for administrative decisions where you had discretion, but I put the legislative just so you know, these are the kinds of decisions that you make: the general plan, ordinance text amendments, subdivision ordinance, general plans, and plan development. Those are also rezones. So you do spend a lot of time. Those are the last 3 columns on the time chart, but you don't really have any discretion. So I'm not recommending any changes to the legislative chart.
So you're talking general, so on this column, it's general plan, zoning text, and zoning map.
It's a statutory requirement that all of those decisions come to the Planning Commission. So we can't take any of those away from you. And we're also required for the first public hearing, you know, the Planning Commission has the first public hearing. I also did not, I lumped in with zoning text amendment the subdivision ordinance text amendment. We only had one of those in the last 3 years, 1 or 2, so I just lumped them into the zoning text amendment because it's basically a land use ordinance text amendment. So then the next chart let's look at is the administrative decisions. So basically these are any kind of decision under the zoning code Title 12. And I also put in, so you can put into perspective that staff actually has quite a number of decisions that they make right now. So the zoning administrator, while the Planning Commission has final decision-making on 12 administrative procedures, the zoning administrator has 11. So the zoning administrator is making quite a few decisions that you don't see or know about, just to understand that workload as well. So you'll see here on permitted uses. So conditional uses, they're not, you know, they're just administrative decisions, but I think it's important that those come to the Planning Commission. My only thought on that would be to say, oh, some kind of CUPs could go to staff, but looking at this chart, you generally don't have that many. I mean, in 2015 and 16, you only had 5 CUPs. So I don't think it's worth changing that. It's a one-step process, it's a public hearing, and you make the decision.
Aren't a lot of the CUPs also coming in hand with?
Some of them are, and this reflects that. So for instance, on the Maverick was a CUP. So I put that, even though it was a site plan and a CUP, it's in both columns in this chart.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
Well, and the CUP allows us to discuss how to mitigate any issues, which seems appropriate to be at this level.
yeah,
obviously.
and just from staff's perspective, I mean, you also have to understand that the developers often push on staff, and, you know, they try to get us to, you know, bend the rules, et cetera. And so it's really nice to have the Planning Commission to look at these things and say, look, we're looking at the traffic, we're looking at the parking. Yeah. I think the Planning Commission does a good job, so I'm not recommending any changes in the CUP. But again, my only thought on that is if you want to carve out some very minor CUPs, but I don't think it's worth the effort of a text amendment if you're only looking at 5 a year, you know.
I think from that perspective, and this kind of was a point that was made apparent to me as we've started to go through the Main Street permitted, you know, type of thing, is to say, maybe there's some things that are conditional that don't need to be conditional.
Well,
Yeah.
that's true.
So, you know, I wholeheartably agree that the CUP should come to the Planning Commission, but maybe there's some stuff. And for example, one of them that came to my mind was, whatever, 8 years ago when we had to review the Rainbow Snow CUP. I mean, really, you know.
Well, maybe we could, are those temporary CUPs or?
Well, there's two categories. There's a temporary use, it's the permitted use that the zoning administrator sees. If they want to exceed the parameters of the permitted use, they're allowed to, but it's the conditional use process to exceed those parameters.
And that may be one where these these snow shacks, you could carve out one little staff approval.
One of the things you'll see common in the city ordinances is they sometimes will split those type of temporary uses out into a major and minor permit and say, okay, this, if it stays in a minor, it's the zoning administrator that applies conditions of approval, appealable to someone, and then other conditional uses obviously stay with the commission.
Right,
Okay.
so that's a good idea. And then but like I said, just in general, especially as we're going through Main Street, maybe thinking about, does this need to be conditional or
Yeah.
can it be permitted? And
Yeah.
then that's one way to.
Well,
That's
and
a-
I think that the city council has made it clear that they don't prefer conditional use. I mean, it's either like, let's not make this a headache where we don't know if we're gonna have this or not. Let's either decide, should we have this or should we not have this?
Because we do generally have to approve it. But
Yes.
I think those are two great ideas, so we'll look at the use list to see if there's some CUPs that should be permitted, so that would take off of this column, and also potentially look at allowing staff to do those little snow shacks and the
Yeah.
Home Depot
The major minor stuff.
parking lot CUP.
Yeah.
Okay, major,
That's-
minor, okay.
That said, I would be cautious about removing too many things from the conditional use side to the permitted side, because once it is a permitted use, there is no ability to mitigate. And I think that that's a really important factor and tool for the city to have. So
Well-
I think that it's definitely worth examining. I think that we should just be careful about
I agree.
how much we get in there and monkey with those, but
Yeah, okay.
it's a good thought.
So two suggestions on CUPs then. So then the next type of application you see is site plan. So there's conceptual site plan and final site plan. It's a two-step process. My suggestion here would be that you consider allowing conceptual site plan to be handled by staff. I think there are there's like 5 things that you have to submit on conceptual site plan. It's not a lot of information. Now, the pro and the con is that we have front-loaded our public hearings. So we have our public hearing, interestingly, although I think we noticed public hearings for final site plans, really the only ordinance
Public meeting
required.
for final.
Okay, so the only public hearing you have on site plans is at conceptual, and then we actually don't have a public hearing on final site plan.
Right.
But, so we initially put the public hearing at the conceptual because it's better to know sooner rather than later if a neighbor says, hey, there's a water line issue, or I'm right next door and there's a fence issue, et cetera. And, you know, a final site plan, they've already engineered it, they've put a lot of effort into it, et cetera, but, you know, that's your pro and con, but I still think that staff, and I'll let Corey weigh in, but that's one idea I have, is to put conceptual site plan at staff level.
Yeah, just a couple of things to point out on the conceptual. One of the advantages, pros of letting staff handle that is because we have a system set up that's fairly aggressive, I think, in most cities. A 3-week time frame to a commission is very fast. I know everybody complains about it, but it is a very fast process. And when you're trying to get fire and the development review committee, fire, building officials, city engineer, all on board, somebody's paid, they've looked at the date that they want to be on the agenda, they pay their money, and we are scrambling in those 21 days to try to get something to you that's halfway decent. And that is a real significant burden on staff to try to negotiate that process and get a report out to you and have some credible application sitting before you that you can feel more comfortable sending on past conceptual. That makes a lot of staff uncomfortable. That's a common complaint through the years I've been here, is that 21 days is not good enough. So that's a plus for staff to move it down to that level. Now, the con side of it is that's where things can get bogged down.
Yeah.
In the grind of government, you know, going on, because, you know, when you have 7 people here trying to negotiate a decision, you have equal amount of people down on a staff level negotiating a decision. And if it stays on that level, staff will push harder, you know, require more, all of those things. And an application now goes from 21 days to 45 days to get through the conceptual. And the public at large is frustrated with city staff if they think there's a way to go above staff to have it discussed and mitigated. That's the downside. So, you know, keep that kind of in mind.
Is there a way that we could put a limitation on that, so that, you know, not that we say like that the staff makes that decision within 3 weeks, but maybe if it goes past a certain time, then
Yeah, I think, yeah, similar to
come
what's
up
done in
here or
state laws
something?
is if it isn't done at a certain time, it defaults up to the commission level to get an answer and get a
Yeah.
resolution.
that's what I mean.
Yeah, so we certainly could look at that. The pros and cons of the other side that I'd point out is, and this is the issue of transparency of government to its public and accountability. An administrative decision is not well understood by the general public. It's, here's the code and we're looking at it, yes or no. It's not really a debated vote.
Right.
The con of having the public participate in a hearing is that they don't generally understand that. We might find the golden nugget about a water line or something out there, but the public really has a tendency to think that you're looking at it from their viewpoint and they're disappointed in it, and then you vote and it's they pass when you had 50 people here saying don't pass it. They don't understand that. And so it's very frustrating to the public to experience that. And that's why we front-loaded it at conceptual rather than have $50,000 worth of drawings done and then say no. So we get it out of the way so that we can get the golden nugget, get the public engaged early on, and then the developer and the land use rights. But again, it's that thought of it's a vote. If you move that down to conceptual, in theory, under the Management Act of the state is that these are supposed to be approved. You meet the code, you approve it. There's not another option. It's the issue of evaluating you meet the code. And there's an appeal process if somebody feels like it didn't meet the code, so they're not out. But now all of a sudden, a Rainbow Shack shows up next to their driveway and they don't even know how it happened. And so the issue of transparency and accountability to the public, seeing surprised things happen and nobody knew about it.
So, Corey, here's an idea on that then. What if we did the conceptual site plan at the staff level, but we still did essentially like a public comment? Let's still put the sign out on the yard that says, hey, something's happening here. Here's your time period for a public comment. And that public comment then needs to be submitted to, for review, so that it's not a surprise to anybody that something's happening. They can go through and look and see and then submit their comments to staff. Staff can do that back and forth, that early fact-finding stuff, and then the final can come here. So we still give the public a chance to comment on it. It puts the burden more on them, that they've got to take the initiative to write the letter or send the email or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But they still get their chance to say, hey, there's a shared sewer line over here,
Yeah. No, I think that's a good idea. The issue now is as though they write in the comment and they say that zoning administrator didn't listen to me, and I'd rather have them say the planning commission didn't listen to me. No.
I know you would.
Yeah, these are great ideas. I should preface this that I'm not trying to solve these. Obviously, I'm just throwing ideas out there that need to be analyzed. So if I say, hey, I think you should consider this, we just want to hear which ideas you like, because then we really need to analyze the details, and because I think we'll think of other things that are creating problems.
The other issue that you're talking about is a comment period. The other issue is rather than it certainly be a certain decision, And then it's going to the Board of Adjustment, who is not really in a position to evaluate what your role is, the appellate process or the submission to the commission for the second opinion may be something that's
Yeah,
valuable.
like you could say if conceptual was at staff level, you could have the appeal go to the planning commission.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But, and I also
I like
wanted
that
to
better.
note, correct misinformation that I gave you earlier. There's actually 18 items in the ordinance on conceptual site plan. I think I was thinking of conceptual subdivision that only has 5, but, so there's about 18 items. But again, you either meet the ordinance and you've submitted them or you don't. And what I think is if this is staff level, we do a more proactive, sorry, we're not even accepting this, it's incomplete.
Yeah.
Because given this time frame, we're noticing before we even know whether they have everything in. And so I think we could be more proactive where our time clock doesn't even start because they haven't given us everything.
Right.
Yeah, because they submit on a Wednesday, the DRC is putting it on that next Monday agenda. If it's a hearing to the paper, that has to be submitted Monday at 5. So we're just, the rest of the DRC is just barely getting introduced to the project and trying to analyze and where we're at. And the frustration that others have with us is, we've already put it in the paper. And now you have friction down at the staff level.
So I think, so the 2 notes that I have, consider going to the staff level for conceptual, but allowing written comment with posted notice, perhaps, at the,
And appeal to planning commission instead of the
Board of Adjustment.
Board of Adjustment if there's an appeal needed.
Is a public hearing required by state law for?
No, that is a choice of Centerville in that point.
I just have a comment. I feel like it would be more beneficial from my perspective to bypass the final site plan onto staff, because I feel like it'll probably about like half of the conceptual site plans that we get. A lot of them are really easy, but for example, Quick Quack, you guys had a lot of comments on that, and that would be really frustrating from the developer's point of view to get all the way to final, be like, I got a staff approval, I've done all my construction plans, and then all of a sudden you guys are gonna
Unload.
change everything.
Pull the rug.
That's a good
Yeah,
And I
point.
feel like that's happened a few times where you guys do have really good input on the conceptual plan of, no, we want it to look like this, or we need more buffering, or stuff like that. And I feel like if anything, the final, you can give your conditions and your recommendations, but I think it would be easier and beneficial for everyone if the final site plan was administrative, because I feel like there are usually, if there are going to be comments, they're all going to be at conceptual. It's not fair to give your input at the very end, I don't think.
well, that's an interesting one. Maybe what we could do on the site plan one is show you what's required at conceptual and what's required at final. And if you wanted to go in that direction, put some of the final, you know, a little bit more into conceptual,
Yeah.
so that final is just
Yeah,
ticking the boxes.
I think
That's
that's
a good
great.
idea.
That's why we hire Cassie to think outside the box. And I agree with some of those points. You look at what fronts Parish Lane is the discussion. But I also think there's a balance, because we would likely have to require more, but we'd have to decide where that requirement of more to look at the conceptual so that you have the bases covered. Because we're writing long reports and saying, and think of this, and think of this, and think of this, and think of this. I think the pushback, and I think Logan might be able to respond on that, is the more you require up front, the more expenditure is made up front. And if they don't know where they're at, they have a little bit of stress on how much is spent for that, here's my idea sketch.
Yeah, I think it's totally catch-22. We deal with that with Centerville in my employment and in other cities, and I think it's a catch-22. But as I consider it, I feel like Cassie's idea makes a lot of sense. Meaning, God, actually, I don't know. There really are pros and cons to this one.
But I think it's a good point that
Yeah.
the developer then goes and expends a lot of money, let's say,
To final.
on a Chick-fil-A or a Walmart, or, you know.
Yeah.
I guess I'm hesitant to even change. It's like it's not taking, either of them taking a lot of our time.
No, the site
That will
plans
make
are.
it-
Oh, yeah, the conceptual takes a ton.
These two.
But we're talking conceptual and
Not
final.
subdivisions.
We're talking site plans.
Those ones.
Okay, sorry. It just seems like there's a lot. Not all of them, but I mean, I'm thinking of the Chad Morris one, the Quick Quack. There's just some that there's so much information that's coming out in these meetings that generates a lot more thought than we or you may have.
I was leaning towards going Lisa's proposed way initially, but after Kathy's comment, I have to admit, I think I am now leaning towards not touching anything, because I want to weigh in on conceptual and I want to weigh in on the final site plan on some projects. So that's funny, because I'm the one who's been kind of pushing moving decisions to staff, but on this one, I think I'm going to give it some thought, but I think I'm more inclined to keep it here.
Yeah, sorry, Kev. You go ahead, please. I'm bald, you go ahead.
This one's got some hair on it, doesn't it, Logan?
You can never say that again. You never can say that again.
No, here's my thought: is if a public hearing is not required for the conceptual site plan, maybe we could still do something like a public comment period to gather all that stuff beforehand. Because I think sometimes some of the problem, it's a mixed blessing, I guess, is we get people who spend a lot of time talking about something and they're really not making much ground on it. And so that way, maybe staff could filter through the public comments, let us know at that conceptual, that first view, here are the public comments, the meaningful ones, without offending people, right?
Or give us a list of all the public comments, and then we can highlight these.
We highlight the ones that.
Highlight the
Be sure to
ones
read
that
A, B, and
were
C,
important.
yeah. D, E, and F are losers, but anyway.
I hate to throw staff under the bus, because I worry about, Corey, your comment that public will submit comments and then staff won't address or won't change them, and then people will think those horrible staff people are not listening to my comments.
Yeah, self-preservation is 3 votes, I'm out of a job by the council, so.
Look, and I am willing to stand up and tell people in public hearing, whoa, staff is doing exactly what they are supposed to do, but I like Kevin's idea, because it almost makes just a tiny bit more work for you guys, right? But if you get comments, you could always say, I'm thinking of almost like when I see regulations in the Federal Register, right? We receive the following comments, and we appreciate that the community feels like X, but we can't address those comments because of Y. And then people, I think, would maybe even get a better explanation than we give sometimes, explaining to public comments.
I see your point. Even in the staff report, we could explain which ones.
Which ones you can
administrative and which ones are
right. Which legally you can consider and which ones legally you can't. So then when people see, hey, look, it's not that they didn't listen to my comment, it's that there was some legal reason why they couldn't incorporate it. I kind of like that.
If that's the case, is there a way that we can increase the time limit from 3 weeks so that you guys aren't feeling like we are now also adding in this extra level of doing public comments, and we have to hurry already? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think the 21 days is a flex issue on how the process is set up, and we could figure out a way to weigh through that, and then still have a X point that if it's getting mired down, then it's bumped to be resolved, rather than just spinning at the staff level.
So are you suggesting eliminating the public hearing before the planning commission at conceptual and just allowing written comment
to staff?
To staff. And giving maybe an additional week for staff.
By a given deadline.
Yeah, I think we would go back and assess how the noticing works, what would change on the noticing, and then what would it take so that we can identify a horizon period that then would get to the commission.
Yeah. But again, remember, in order for people to give legitimate comment, they need to see the staff report. So it's a little, I think it has some practical difficulties, because you have to be able to tell them, here's what's being proposed and here's the staff report, so that they can respond. I also think you're still going to have people showing up to the meeting, because that's when they find out and when they come.
I think they want to be heard, not just from a letter and hear a response, whether they like it or not.
Now, you could do a better job managing your public hearings and say, we'd like you to limit your comments to 2 minutes.
About half hour?
That's always fun for the chair.
That's so fun.
That's not very fun.
That's why they give me the gavel.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things on how we could maybe limit site plan conceptual site plan, but a lot of these things seem to be sort of canceling each other out. Let's go back to Cassie's suggestion about final site plan. Does anyone feel comfortable just passing that over when we give the approval for conceptual, with directions? Is there anything that makes you uncomfortable just allowing staff to give that final approval?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes the things we want that we would say in conceptual, like we think your truck should be here, or we think that you should consider this and that. Sometimes the resolution of that isn't clear cut, meaning sometimes after staff and the applicant come back together, they can't do it exactly like the planning commission said. They're listening to the concern and trying to address it, but the solution might be a little different. And so I could see that as a scenario where we said, well, yeah, we wanted you to address that, but both staff and the applicant said, well, we couldn't address it like you thought we could. We thought we'd address it this way instead, and we might feel a little submarined if that came back. I would like to see the items that are required conceptual, I should know that, versus final site plan. I would actually consider lowering what's required at conceptual so staff can get a less burdensome, quicker turnaround time to get feedback earlier as well. So maybe load more towards final, lighten up conceptual a little bit to make it truly conceptual.
So like, call it sketch?
Sketchual, the sketchual.
Sketch plan?
But still, would you still keep the review of both the conceptual and the final site plan with the planning commission?
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing the ring around the rosies thing too, but yeah, I withdraw my second to Lisa's motion. And yeah, I think I'd keep them both, frankly, at planning commission level, because this body is often the most authoritative in their requests and changes for the applicant. So I feel like I'd leave them both here, but lighten up this conception. That's where I'm leaning right now, but I'd like to analyze those requirements.
Well, how about next time? Why don't we leave this as undecided? And at the next meeting, we'll put this on the agenda again, but we'll have the ordinance that shows you what they have to submit at
Required.
conceptual and what they submit at final.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as long as you're putting that together, I would love to see Corey's proposal with regard to the conditional use to consider splitting decisions from major, minor, so that we could take a look at what that would potentially change as well. As much as I like addressing snow shack issues, I think that we could find a way to push
You
that.
just want to weigh in on the 36 flavors that they propose.
It's true.
Can you also, you can say no if this feels too burdensome. Can you also just give us a really brief, and I think you have verbally, but I just like to see on paper how our noticing is for each thing so that I can see what
Yes, we
your
can give it to you,
requirements
but
are.
it is one where you need some type of
Yeah, I have a noticing matrix. We'll put that in the
supernatural
packet.
interpretation.
That's what I would like to
sometimes.
see. I would like to see the
Noticing
noticing matrix.
Because you will not believe what we have to do.
It is.
And I want you to highlight what is required
By state law.
noticing matrix. Can you
With
highlight that part?
statutory
Versus
versus
discretionary.
Discretionary.
versus
Like
ordinance.
I-
Okay.
I think that would be good for, wow, that's probably 90% of what our timeframes are struggling with is making sure we track and.
I'd like
keep the
to see
noticing.
that.
Okay, so I will bring back for the next meeting the conceptual versus final application requirements and the noticing matrix, and then Corey can come back with some ideas on the
Major, minor
CUP,
permit.
major, minor. Okay.
I didn't mean to get you sidetracked. Do you want to finish putting through
Yeah, so
the-
let's go. I only have 2 suggestions on these, so, because the rest of these, so, I don't even think we ever have had a conceptual site plan amendment. So final site plan amendments, you're gonna have to listen to, because they just come to you. But we do divide those into major and minor. Minor ones that don't
Yeah.
really impact things that the planning commission has already made a specific condition. We do allow staff to do minor site plan amendments. So there's a lot of those you don't see already. And there were very few site plan amendments that have come through. Special exceptions, rarely. The landscaping waiver and the parking modifications, I think you need to look at those. And those usually come Right now, we're not charging an extra fee. I think we should personally, but then we have to come up with an application, but because it requires another analysis, but we usually do it just as part of the site plan. You'll see that. Home occupation, just a CUP. We already talked about that. And public utility stations, CUP.
That's the big ones.
And sexually oriented business, CUP. I mean, I really could just lump these into CUPs. And then, yeah, wireless telecom, CUP. So the only, really on this list, we're gonna zero in on site plans and CUPs and maybe lighten the burden, but yeah, maybe not. Maybe we live with what we have.
Well, I think there's a chance.
Unless anybody else had some ideas, but the rest of them, you really don't, I didn't even put them on here because they were probably within a site plan, you
Yeah.
know, those modifications.
I was gonna say, I think if we clean it up, we could take 2 heavy items and turn it into a heavier item and then a quicker item, and the net effect might be really good, but.
Okay. So that'll be a good discussion for next time. So then the final chart is your subdivision decisions. And we do have in the works, and we already have a draft of a completely revised and revamped subdivision ordinance that we hired a consultant to do. And staff just needs to go through that and bring it to the Planning Commission. So when you're ready, we can do that. But right now, the Planning Commission sees 1, 2, 3, 4. You see 4 different subdivision applications. On just a regular subdivision, you'll see the conceptual, the preliminary, and the final. And then the final also goes to the city council. So Centerville City looks at a subdivision plat 4 times, which I think is a little much. So my thoughts on these, you could let conceptual subdivision go to staff, but there's the pros and cons that are similar to the site plan that we talked about, but it's a little mitigated because there's a preliminary. So they're expending more money, but not quite as much as final site plan. So one thought, let conceptual subdivision go to staff. Another thought is to eliminate the final subdivision plat from the city council. I don't know if they'd go for that, but it's an administrative decision. They can't really change much at that point. We're really far down the line. We're just setting ourselves up for risk, in my opinion, but those are some thoughts. But to counter that, in our small subdivision lot split waiver, they bring in a conceptual subdivision plan, and I think I mentioned to you, there's only 5 or 6 things that they're required to show at conceptual subdivision, which is minimal. It's just, show us that it maybe could be divided into things that look like lots. That's basically what our ordinance says. I think we need at least 2 steps in the small, so I'm suggesting in our rewrite that we actually have a 2-step, even on those little ones, that you have a conceptual, you get to skip preliminary, and then you just bring the final. And that one is a significant burden for staff because they show us so little, and then there's no application that they submit after that, so we just send them email after email of, oh, you need to do this, oh, you need to do this. We really need an application to say, these are the
Final.
50 things you need to show us, and just submit a final plat.
Is there a way to take off, like, preliminary subdivision plat? Or like remove
Well,
one of those?
I'm open to anything. I was just kind of looking at the procedure, so yeah, anything that you can talk about the pros and cons, but
The reason the preliminary sits in there is from the subdivision layout perspective. I think the simplified answer is, yeah, you probably eliminate that. You don't need to show it 3 consecutive times on how you're designing the lots. But the preliminary is the first time the engineer's seen construction drawings for improvements.
yeah, let me look up.
So can you require that at conceptual?
Yeah, but that's a huge expenditure because conceptual is showing where utility lines are and where the locations are. The construction drawings are actually beginning to how those improvements are going to be extended and constructed and installed. And that's a significant, that preliminary is a significant role of the city engineer at that point.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things that they have to, basically the name, the vicinity plan, proposed lot and street layout, culinary water, you know, sewer, total acreage, and proposed changing to zoning. But we could do the same thing and show you what's required at each different
Yeah.
level, if you want, on that. Any
Yeah.
other ideas from Corey or Cassie on subdivisions?
I would definitely agree that conceptual could be at the staff level.
Yeah, I think the other place to discuss, depending on the thoroughness of your review, do you need to see the final? Or can the preliminary be beefed enough that you know you got to do this for final? And if the council won't go for the final coming back to the commission, can the final just be pushed to council?
Oh, yeah.
That'd be nice, take it away from us.
Just leave it in one of the 2 bodies courts.
But can anybody, well, maybe you explain to me why then the final and then the amendments, including the street vacation, go to the city council and not, because a site plan just stays at the planning commission, and a subdivision is, it's kind of like a site plan, I
I know,
guess,
right?
right? But, you know.
Yeah, the difference, there's some significant difference because the plat is a recording document going to this county recorder. And in that document, the city's accepting the easements, the city's accepting the streets, and the bonds and the warranties that come with public infrastructure much more. In theory, the site plan is mostly private, except for some infrastructure upgrades, in theory. The subdivision is we're accepting new streets, new easements in the name of the city for perpetual care after the warranty disappears. And that's why a council typically retains that
Makes sense.
authority.
What if we took conceptual subdivision plat, put it in staff, beefed up the preliminary, and then moved final subdivision to just city council?
That's one way of doing it. I've seen it done that way.
And then split apart the waiver to have a 2-step process, which is similar to that, where you have maybe one in front of the,
Yeah, and just leave that at the
Staff,
commission, leave
and
that
then
at the
leave it at
commission just to
commission.
look at the final on that and then
Yeah.
let them record. So instead of doing 3 steps, they're doing 2.
I suspect that the city council would be reluctant to give up the authority to approve the final subdivision plats. I mean,
that's why I said move it just to them.
so I like that idea a lot. I
Where
do.
you've weighed in really heavy on the preliminary, that's where your role is, making sure it's compliance. Now they're just got to finalize their construction drawings
Yep.
and the plat and go to the council.
Yeah, the only concern and the reason we left it when we did draft the original subdivision ordinance is that, you know, you'll add a lot of conditions at preliminary, and looking at the final, you get to make sure that they addressed all of your issues. So if you do this, I'm not opposed to it, but it's just everybody's just seeing it for the first time. Staff does conceptual, planning commission does preliminary, and city council does final.
Well, we could
Well, it
enter
just
a
means-
process where the chair does the verification as part of their signature.
Or it also means that we, it also means that we state our reasons and our, you know, we have to say up in our minutes so that those minutes go up to the city council, you know, based on these things, and they're essentially getting a public hearing from us.
Or if they're, you know, you could also handle it where you either table it at preliminary if you don't like it, you know, and make sure it's right, or reserve the right for the planning commission to say they want to see final, but they don't, if requested, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's an option, is you could say that the determination of whether final has to come back to you or move on to the council and let you have
I
that
like
discretion.
I like that for the other one, too.
I like that for both of them.
For the
Site
site plan
plans.
stuff, maybe you too.
Yeah.
Lisa, your worries
that as
on,
an
I don't
option.
remember how you phrased it. A lawsuit in waiting, or I don't remember, or the liability concern that you expressed?
Putting us at risk to have administrative decisions at the council level.
Do you feel like to go preliminary conceptual and then jump to the council to get the final, kind of with that jump, increases that risk that you're worried about?
No, because that's the way it is now. The council doesn't see it till final anyway.
Okay.
That's,
so by taking
they only
us,
see it one time.
By taking us out of the final process, that's essentially an indifferent effect on your liability. Okay.
Because we already are at risk under the existing way that it's structured.
Because we've granted rights or something?
Because the city council is making an administrative decision.
And often you have tension between their elected office
Right.
as a legislative versus
and
the
they're
administrative
in the mode
decision.
of considering public clamor.
Yeah, I mean, this is why LUDMA was, I mean, the councils can retain a lot of authority, but the advice of everybody under the Land Use Management Act is that you utilize your commission and you utilize your staff in those administrative decisions so that the clamor issues at a legislative level doesn't make decisional risks in lawsuits in the future.
From a legal standpoint, I would prefer to keep the final decision with the Planning Commission. I just wonder from a practical standpoint if that's something that our city council would be willing to move to the Planning Commission level.
Mm-hmm.
So that may be something that we want
It's
to
worth
talk
having the
about
discussion.
Yeah.
I don't know if
City
they,
Let's shoot for it.
I'm great having the discussions.
now it is interesting, typically the mayor signs the plat, so we'd want to look into those issues, but, okay. And then, yeah, and depending on where you place the final plat decision, you would make the similar adjustment to subdivision plat amendment, which is a one-step process, and the amendment with a street vacation, actually that one may need to go to the council,
Yeah, I
because
think
that's
the-
statutory.
I think that's statutory on the.
Both of those.
But
The
what you were,
the plat amendment not involving public property, I'm not sure where that lands, but when it involves a vacation of a street or the sale of excess land, that is a legislative.
It says statutory on your matrix.
Yeah.
So.
well, the hearing's statutory.
Oh.
But yeah, I think it probably goes to the council, so.
Lisa, when you're coming back with your recommendations, I would love to see you, what you would propose in terms of making the small subdivision waiver lot split a two-step process.
And what would be required at each step?
Right.
The intent on our structure is the purpose of the small subdivision is to increase its efficiency because it's, under state law, 10 or less than 10 lots can be exempted from the platting requirement. We choose a very conservative rate of 2, only 2 that we do that way. But I can tell you that if the small subdivision, whether it's 2 or whether it's 7, isn't appropriately set, it creates a lengthened delay like Lisa's talking about. We are scrambling to get them to get things in an order to be recorded, and that's where it bogs down at staff, and we're not liked by the time the plat gets recorded.
What?
Lisa, I want to commend you and thank you for all of the work that you put into these matrices. I think that, and particularly your planning commission decisions chart to show us where we are spending our time. I think that this was incredibly helpful, and I know that that was a lot of work on your end, so I appreciate that. I think that this process also reflects that we as a planning commission are a separate body from the city council, and there are items, I mean, the city council has a lot on their plate and they can't conceive of everything and push it down to us. I think that we as a planning commission, there is a purpose for us to be proactive in identifying areas that may not be on the city council's radar, that we can identify and suggest improvements and send it up to the city council for their consideration. So I think that this process demonstrates that, and I'm glad to see us being proactive about making changes.
Yeah,
So.
well, thank you. And I don't know if you want to just take it a step at a time, like one meeting we look at site plan and understand that process and make any decisions whether to make amendments, and then the next time we'll do the CUPs, or what do you think is going to be the most productive in reaching our goal?
I think I would be inclined to do one at a time so that we can be very careful and deliberate in our analysis.
And that would give us time to focus on the issue to be
Yeah.
prepared for the meeting.
Okay, well, why don't we just, if it's okay, we'll just start with the site plan?
Yeah.
Because we're not sure we're going to make any amendments, but let's look at it and understand. And I think getting feedback from the commission as well, it's worth looking at our ordinances and saying, is there anything that should be in conceptual? Are we, you know, should we front load that a little more, or do the ordinances strike the right balance? So let's do that for next time.
And this may be totally off. Would there be any value, or is it ever done that we have a conceptual site plan and a preliminary site plan, sort of similar to how it's structured here, and where we could have a conceptual that does it does staff level, and then we take the preliminary for us?
Yeah, you'll see what they call, I did it tongue in cheek, but they call it sketch plan. So you have a sketch plan, preliminary site plan, final site plan. That's a process out there. Summit County uses that quite frequently. And the sketch plan is a much simpler process, and preliminary is not intensive like a final for the commission to weigh in. We've chosen to
do you see value in that at all, or is that?
I think there's value in it in the debating process, and I think there's the positive of that in the issue of decision-making efficiency. I think the con side of it is you're seeing time and time again that the state is putting pressure on municipalities to look at efficiency of processing, look at speed of processing to reduce the cost, particularly when you're dealing with some type of housing project. They're wanting you to streamline your processes rather than add to them. So the streamlining is a relative statement. Will going sketch, preliminary, final, stream it?
That's what I'm saying.
And it depends on how much noticing and period of review is expected is where the streamline, the meat of the streamline is.
And just in my experience, of course, Corey and Cassie do more with the site plans, but I think that we have sufficient time on those. You know, I think some subdivisions, you know, conceptual, preliminary, final is too much because they're so easy, but, you know, we're trying to draft an ordinance that'll cover, you know, the average.
And
so.
we've come unofficially to the commission, particularly on subdivisions, where the preliminary and final are so easy. We've asked you to.
That's true.
We've asked you at conceptual if they can package them, bundle them together.
Yeah. And just, if I could, I realized I will not be at the next Planning Commission meeting on the 9th. I have my Utah Municipal Attorneys Conference. So if I could do the site plan one on the 23rd, Corey, I don't know if you'll be ready for the CUP on the 9th, but maybe
whatever the commission wishes,
you
we can do
cover
this.
something else on the 9th because I won't be here.
We can add the minor major permit issue still.
On the 9th.
On the 9th, and then the site plan on the 23rd.
What's on the 9th?
Major, minor CUP issues.
Great, thank you so much. Anything else, Lisa?
That's it. I think it's a great project to look at.
It's a good discussion.
Fantastic. All right, moving on to the next item on our agenda. It is technically minutes review and acceptance.
Yeah, and I apologize. Mackenzie did send them down to staff, but we failed to post them. So the communication broke down while she left town.
No worries. We'll just hit those the next go around. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something.
No, you
so,
that was our error. I'll take it.
All right, and turn the time over for staff for their report.
Cassie, applications. We have a couple items on the next meeting, right? We have the council enacted some fence height due to a complaint about agricultural versus residential. It seems like we had one other application, but we have a meeting set up for you.
The amended site plan.
Yeah, we don't know. There's amended site plan. We don't know if it can stay administrative or go to the planning commission. So I can coordinate with the chair and where we're at with that application. Just some upcoming, I know I sent out some emails. Hopefully it wasn't such a deflation from your excitement of the last meeting. So I'll keep this to 15 minutes. The issue of the work session of the city council, I've received 4 that would be able to make that 22nd meeting, and not 323, 322, 522. So they would like to have a work session on your goals. I know you put some timelines to them. We left the timelines in to try to send the message to the council that you're eager to be productive and not get mired down 3 years later with the same goal. But I think you could send that message, but they wanted to have that work session on the goals. The issue of the Main Street uses, I know you're ready to tackle it. I think it would be more prudent, not at your skills and qualities. It's not taking on to that. It's my perception. First, that the city council they're not on the same page. How do I say that politely? They're not together on we're ready for the use list. We have some complaints about even the survey that we performed and whether it has value. And so it was my impression. Others had mixed impressions. I checked with council members, and they do have their individual opinions that you're going to meet again on the use list before they just say, turn it loose for the commission. So I think you could use that work session, if you're okay, where I could structure the business items to be able to discuss the goals. But the way I discussed it with the city manager is on the use list, trying to be correct and not offend anybody. I don't think they can come to a decision of their own on the use list. I'm in your boat of let's go forward and plan something and then see where it lands. I think what I would like to structure the memo going to the planning or to the city council is in this goal setting, we will have a subsection, particularly on the Main Street uses, and see if we can get them to say, here's the curb of the road and here's the curb of the road. Let us move forward. Part of that is I think they're going to want some extra noticing because there are some watchful eyes about uses onto the Main Street. And so if we can get them to identify where the curb and the center line of the road is without coming to an agreement that everybody is comfortable with the amendments, because I think there should be some tension. There's going to be tension from staff, tension from the Planning Commission as we go up and talk, and then the public, and talk about the use list. But I think you could get that, if we could get that parameter set at the work session and then turn us and yourself as a body loose on the use list. And so I'd like to get your feedback in this. Would that be something that you think we could structure inside of the work session so we can parse it out to get the use table moving, and then you can take the other goals and discuss why you think those are a priority, like the West Side Plan?
Yes, I think that we should tackle both. Ultimately, if there are any changes that are made to the use list, it's going to be in the city council's court. Right. And so our efforts at the last meeting that we had was simply to advance the ball, because ultimately we can talk until we're blue in the face, but it doesn't matter what we think.
And if we have another work session, it'll just end with no results again. So if I can structure it to say, okay, we're meeting, but here we want your guidelines of where the bumper stops are, and then get them to commit to let us to turn loose on the use list.
Could we have you at the work session bring just the ones that we asked Cassie to identify that had like just the majority?
Yeah.
You know, and we don't have to talk about the whole use list, but if she were to parse it down and bring that to the work session and just say, listen, we're not trying to talk about every little thing here. Yeah. We recognize that on a lot of these, we have, agreement that we don't want to touch this, or we don't need to address this issue. But there are some that generally accepted we should look at.
I think it's a great idea if we add that in kind of the memo before of here's where expectations, we want your guidance, and here is the box of uses that we think are important.
The frustration that I have is that it's simply, I'm always happy to talk to the city council, and I definitely want to make sure that we're on the same page with the city council, because ultimately our goal is to be helpful to them. At the same time, we can go through the work session and they can send it back to us, and we can parse it more finely. We can talk about it. If it's helpful to the city council for us to further debate uses, we're happy to do that, but ultimately we will be sending back the
exact
same
thing.
thing to the city council. And it's ultimately going to be their decision on the use process. So if their concern is that they want more by way of process in order to involve the public more during this process and to put it more on the public's radar, I think that that is a valid concern, and I'm happy to do that. I would just, from my perspective on this planning commission, I would like to advance the ball on items that I think that it's within our purview to advance the ball. We are independent from the city council, and
No,
we have responsibilities on our own. And while we certainly take direction from the city council, I want to make sure that we have our agenda and that we're moving forward with our agenda, and we try to make that as cohesive with the city council as we can. But
And I also think it's important that the city council understands they were elected. We understand that. We were appointed. There's specific reasons for both. And there are specific reasons for us as a body to have autonomy to look at specifically planning issues. We aren't looking at the whole thing. We understand that. We aren't looking at some of these financial issues, some of these other things that they get to look at. And we're grateful that they have that opportunity and that ability to do so. That's why we send up our recommendations to them. But as I would just echo what was just said, I feel a little bit like we shouldn't be just waiting to have them tell us exactly what they want us to do, because we have a charge as a commission to put forth our recommendations for planning.
And I recognize your desire for that. I have to counter some balance to it, that the council sets the agenda of the department heads in the administration. And so if that support's not there, you won't be getting what you want in getting the stuff done. And so there is a portion of convincing them why a vision needs to take place and what the commission is willing to tackle. I think that's an important message, but it does come at their discretion of what they will spend resource and monies to and time through the mayor and the executive branch to get that done. And we have to recognize that because, you know, just to be frank and honest, I'm employed by the council. So I'm there to do their job. They're my employers. And so everything that is looked and answered is to that employment relationship. It's certainly my job to facilitate you and get up there to what you vision to want, but it is their job to set whether they'll spend that resource to that vision. And that's the tension that occurs. And to be honest with you, we're on YouTube, so they're used against me. Our city council is not in a proactive mindset. They're very much a citizen-driven body, and they very much want that transparency to respond to the public as a whole. And that becomes a much more bumbling system and a much less efficient system as they react to that clamor that's coming from the public than setting a vision of leadership towards something and then trying to convince the public that that's the vision we ought to take. And that's the tension and struggle we're having.
I appreciate staff's perception with regard to effectuating what we think is important, because ultimately we simply make recommendations to the city council. And so I certainly don't want to do anything on a planning commission level that would be counterproductive to advancing our agenda. And I do see, like I said, if the city council is concerned, the use table is something that we need to talk about more, if for nothing else than to put it on the public's radar so that they're more committed to the process. I can certainly get behind that. I just, and I would love to sit together with the city council and make sure that we're all on the same page and move forward. I just think, like we went through the process tonight, I mean, it might not be on the city council's radar that, hey, maybe we could improve some of the processes that we have. And so I want to make sure that we are doing the best that we can to fulfill our responsibilities and to do things that are good for our city.
Yeah, and I hope I don't come across as a naysayer. I think we tried to send the memo with your time frames, and you can have those discussions. You know, my honest opinion is that you agreed to the use list, and I think you're comfortable with the use list. I do not think the council's comfortable at all, and it's something that they have to tackle. But I think it is also a visionary process. They have not come to grips whether the South Main Street corridor plan should stay in place or be completely eliminated. And that's something that they're not ready to take a position on because it comes with the consequence of a decision.
Yep.
And they just have not grappled with that enough. And they need to get to that point. They need to make that decision. And right now, it's been difficult for them to make that decision.
You know, Corey, and I will also say that we appreciate staff for the tension that they have to maintain. We recognize that there is some tension in policy. There's tension in politics, there's tension in policy, there's tension in government, and it's not easy to have to respond to developers, respond to citizens, respond to planning commissioners, and respond to city council members. I mean, there's a lot of competing interests and nuances that are held by the position that you play. So I appreciate that you are willing and able to deal with that tension, and never at any time in furthering the work of the Planning Commission and the goals that we have, and in the desire that I think a lot of us share to be proactive and to be autonomous, do we want to wish any additional tension upon you. I want that to be clear. We don't want any additional tension to come from any source because of the goals that we're trying to do. And so we will be sensitive in how we do that, but we will still maintain our autonomy and still try to work towards bettering the planning goals for Centerville.
Yeah, I would hope that you would take that role seriously as you've expressed.
There is a built-in remedy here, which is that if we send something up and we're not on the same page as the city council, they can just deny it, right? They can table it forever. And so from my perspective, I mean, I always look at it and say, look, if we're being too proactive, like the city council, they can just ignore us, yes, right, effectively. And so there is that escape valve, but I do appreciate the guidance of staff. I mean, I think that, you know, I will defer to you. You work with the city council far more than I do in terms of their temperature. And so if you're telling me that there is a better way to advance our agenda than just pushing it up the way that it is, then I am willing to defer to that.
I don't know if it's better. I'm hoping there's wisdom in this.
So I would like to, for the work session, then put 2 items on that agenda list. The first is to carve out the use list and then also talk about the goals. And I'll leave it to your discretion.
Okay, I will send out a memo carving that up. I talked about that with the city manager today because as much as I might be creating a little bit of pushback, and it's not even the right word, but it's the tension that's there. I do advocate the city manager, your wants and desires to be proactive, to be aggressive. We had the conversation about how to structure the work session so that it can move forward and not spend time in the quicksand as it has in the past.
I would caption that as being proactive, not necessarily aggressive.
Yes.
I mean, I think that there is a distinction.
Yeah, well, yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Use the wrong word.
It's all good. Any other comments from staff report? All right, well, unless anybody else has anything burning on their minds to talk about, I would move that we adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Amen.
Aye.
Okay, just remember, I'm gonna be here next time, so be on your best behavior.
Logan's gonna run wild.
Logan, I should have let you second that because you're bald.
Oh, jeez, rub it in.
I can't believe you said that. You are the funniest guy.
For the record, I thought that you were wearing the hat to support the jazz.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he said. That's what he said.